What's up again, guys? Thank you so much for joining in on my YouTube channel again. My name is Tando and welcome to my YouTube channel, also known as Dollface Tando M. Here we explore and we repair and we do DIYs, shop thriftily, and we try to get the best bargain for the best prices, but also not affording to lose any of the quality that we so dearly seek. So this video is actually long overdue, guys. I had initially received an SOS about a light fixture that had been broken by, the little bambinos, the kitties, who touch and grab and fiddle and pull on everything, even though it's decorative and it's quite expensive. After inspection of the initial photos that she had sent me, I had realized then that it's just going to be a matter of fixing and reframing and restructuring, as it's lost its rigidity and its original shape and form when it became pulled apart. So on initial inspection, I then asked her to just measure it for me with the widest diameter in mind, so that I know what parts to replace and how big to go for the replacement, and where and how to shop for it. So I did find a few of these pieces at the local China mall that's on Nazareth Road. This is just a Chinese round lantern that I found in white. I couldn't find the original color, which did have a slight effect on the brightness of the light in the end, but I actually found that it did not contrast too much with the lights alongside it, and I did quite like the end look of it all. But do stay tuned and see how it all worked out. So as you guys saw on the first frame, the wire support was actually pulled and stretched apart, and as such I had to cut and restructure everything. So this was me then separating the torn apart wire structure with the feathers attached onto it, and then trying to rebuild and regain rigidity of the actual lantern that I'm adding on as a support, whilst winding up the free-lying wire and feather piece together. On first thoughts, I thought that this would be an easy fix, as this was still day one. So as I was going, I thought that I have enough on me and for the lantern at the time to just go add and attach and just then recenter everything and be able to put it up all in one day. Probably at most I was giving this job off the top of my head about 2-3 hours max, but unfortunately as things went, it was not to be that way. I ended up taking this home with me to fill in the extra gaps. I did, however, use as much of the original ostrich feathers as I could, and upon almost finishing up at the site, I ended up realizing that I was going to have spare empty spaces and gaps that needed filling, of which required me to go shopping and actually trying to work a way to build these feather pieces to add on to the gaps that are now there. Now, the easy part of all this repair was just to reattach and just to realign and recenter the bottom pieces and the fallen off parts of the feathers and wire strands. This was by far the easiest part of this, and I hadn't actually thought that I was going to face more difficulties, as this is how it started. But as I went, I did realize that I did use quite a lot of hot glue, and I needed to restructure the actual sphere to be less of a globe and to have more of a bulging center, and to have the widest part of this be towards the center of the pendant light that I'm replacing at this point. So I then carried on by removing the other piece of the drawn out metal string from the top part of the feather pendant light that had been now torn apart. After the removal, I kind of wound up the remainder of this onto the newly attached lantern part, while trying to take care to remeasure each point to be as accurate as possible. I did have a guest at this time, which was quite comical because she kept saying to me, "Why are you recording this? Why are you recording this?" I then tried to explain to her the art of content creation whilst working, just to show and maybe share some skills in a particular thing that you may be doing at that point in time. So to try get as close as possible a shape to the original, what I was doing here was creating a sort of equator by stapling together parts from the center and bringing those parts closer to each other. This was the original shape of the lantern that had been broken, and I did this by just a side comparison to the other two lanterns as close as I could possibly get it to be. And after stapling, that's when I covered it with more of the feather windings that I had excess of from the torn off feather string. So I kept winding as much as I could, but the closer I got to the top part of the lantern piece that I was repairing, I did realize that I was going to actually run short of material, and this is when I had to then come up with a second draw plan of what I would be able to do. As you all know, ostrich feathers are not easily found in markets, nor are they an actual inexpensive purchase. So what I had to do was get a replica or as close alike a look of feathers and style to try to reattach or fill in the gaps that I would soon see forming here. So to allow for easier traveling, I reattached as much of the tail as I possibly could and wound as far as that one could go, but I did not reattach the top piece, which was laying aside. That I wanted to do as soon as I had enough feathers to fill in. That would be my guide on how much to probably purchase to weave myself, because that what would be required of me. I would actually need to sort and weave feathers into another string or parts that would be able to fill in the missing gaps. So on my initial calculations and online checks of where and what types of feathers I can use, I had initially thought that I'd be able to just get the generic white feathers that are synthetic, that are made and sold at the various places. P&A has them, Westpac has them, but when I did get to those places, they actually didn't have a color match for what I needed. I was willing to go to or get a replacement that is either white or just slightly bright, or even as far as cream, but they had rather brighter and more vivid colors. For the most part, the most common that I found were the pinks and blue feathers that were sold at both Westpac and P&A and other stationers that were around my area, up to the point where I had to go to the crafters market, where I actually found myself some goose feathers which were white enough to fit the look, but not too bright that they'd be so starkly different and end up standing out far too much from the original piece. Now, the longest part of this entire project was actually sorting and fluffing feathers, and I ended up sneezing the entire weekend because I spent about 7 to 8 hours just weaving, sorting and fluffing feathers and creating little wefts of these parts that I was going to use to fill the missing gaps on my piece. So this was painstaking, and it took quite a lot of time as well as quite a lot of effort, but in the end it did work out. I made a couple of wefts, I'd say about 20 of this size wefts and about 10 of half this size, and the rest of the spots I just used individual feathers to fill. But these wefts I used ribbon that I purchased, as well as craft glue, which is a strong enough hold but not so strong that it actually burns through the feather itself. I realized that when I tried to use my hot glue gun at this point, it was actually causing the ribbon to form a weird shape, and it bubbled and it heated so much that it actually burnt the ribbon off. So yeah, this is sped up, but I promise you guys, each of these wefts that I created with the feathers and the ribbon took about 10 to 15 minutes each, aside from the sorting of feathers. That on its own was its own entire time. But yeah, eventually it did work out. I had enough feathers to fill as it stands. I've got enough feathers to probably try do another piece, but before continuing to add on the filling parts of the feathers that I had just weft, I decided to add the top on so I can actually see and have a guide of where to fill and what to do next. So as this went, I did realize that I probably initially did a bit of a skew job with the first bit of the pendant repair, like the bottom part that I started off with. But this was my savior, as I had now wefts that I created. So most of them went onto the mostly missing side with the larger gap, and then the rest of which I filled just the empty spaces in between. And that was it, guys. Yeah, that was the last part of this DIY tutorial on how to repair, replace, or possibly even build your own feather pendant light. So you can use this as a guide for either one of those things. This is the final look. This is how they all look back together again. And as said before, it was brighter than the rest of the two, but yeah, it did work out in the end, guys. Thanks again for watching. I always appreciate it. Please do ensure to follow and subscribe on both my social media platforms. My Instagram channel as linked or shown before. I'll also put that in the description box. Please do subscribe onto me there, as well as I do post some items and things faster and more of a daily basis type than I do as I post on my YouTube channel. Okay, again guys, thanks so much for watching. Bye.